122 is surveillance video of Mr. Crumbley dropping his son off at school.
Correct.
And then I believe you also testified that there was additional exhibits showing that Mr. Crumbley went to the horse barn that day.
Correct.
That would be November 30th of 2021.
That's correct.
He was waiting for a vet.
Correct.
And that was consistent with the conversation from the day before about one of the horses having some medical issues.
Correct.
So Exhibit 131, you see that Jennifer Crumbley sent James Crumbley a picture of the math assignment that was sent to her by the school.
Correct.
And we've talked about this math assignment, and I'm sure that we'll talk about it more, but there were two versions that were sent, correct?
Correct.
And in that thread, there were two versions that were sent, from what you can see.
Correct.
James obviously expressed some concern.
In one text, yes.
In fact, he said, "My God, WTF."
Correct.
And we don't have to say what that means, but WTF. Jennifer says that their son was upset, and she used the word, quote-unquote, distraught about the night before.
Correct.
James says in response that he talked about it, assuming he means the night before, with their son. Correct?
We talked about it. I'm sorry. What?
In referring to it, we can presume that they're talking about the night before, based on the response to Mrs. Crumbley's text. And if you don't want to presume that, you don't have to.
Yeah, I don't.
Okay.
I can't, yeah.
So James Crumbley says, we talked about it this morning.
That's
Correct?
what he said, yes.
Yes. There was no conversation after that about Mr. Crumbley saying, based on that conversation with his son, that he has concerns.
Correct.
In fact, I believe the next message is, did you talk to him?
That's correct.
Thank you. We know that on November 30th of 2021, James and Jennifer Crumbley went to Oxford High School.
That's correct.
They met at the school around 10:30 a.m.
A little after that, but yes.
The prosecutor asked you if Mr. Crumbley went to the house before going to the school, and you said no.
Correct.
We know that Mr. Crumbley was at the horse barn. He left there and went directly to the school.
Correct.
And that was based on the exhibit that you looked at yesterday.
That's correct.
On his way there, he spoke to his wife.
Correct.
Mr. Crumbley and his wife met with Sean Hopkins at Oxford High School for approximately 13 minutes.
I think it was a little less than that, but yes.
Their son was in the meeting for about 12 of the 13 minutes.
Yeah, almost 12.
James left the school parking lot at 10:57 a.m.,
Okay.
if you recall.
I don't recall the exact time he left, but it sounds about right because they left the counselor's office before that.
You testified that at 11 a.m., Mr. Crumbley logged into his DoorDash app
That's correct.
from the Meyer parking lot on Gray Road.
Yes.
That his first pickup and delivery was from 11 a.m. to 11:19 a.m., if you recall.
Sounds about right. Yes, correct.
So he left the school and started working right away,
Correct.
within 3 minutes. Is that fair?
Yes, correct.
The prosecutor asked you if he stopped by his house during that first DoorDash, and you said no.
That's correct.
To your knowledge, on November 30th of 2021, from 11 a.m. to 11:19 a.m., Mr. Crumbley didn't have any reason to stop by his house.
Judge,
That you know of. That you know
speculation,
of.
Judge.
If you know, do you know of any reason?
Was he told? I don't understand the. I apologize.
No. Are you aware of any reason that Mr. Crumbley may have known that he needed to go to his house from between 11 to 11:19 on November 30th of 21?
Judge, I think perhaps the better objection would be calling for a legal conclusion because that's central to the theme of the prosecution, that he did have reason to stop. That's what the jury's being asked to decide.
I guess I don't know how he would know that. Right?
It's based upon his level of knowledge from the last months in the life, Judge. That's what the evidence has shown.
I can move on, Judge.
Thank you,
I
Judge.
just don't know how he would know that.
You identified Exhibit 147 as an email that was sent. Would you like to review it?
I believe that's fine. Thank you.
As an email that was sent from Oxford High School to James Crumbley.
Correct.
That was sent at sometime around 1 p.m.
1:09 p.m. But yes.
That was after, actually, the shooting had ended.
Correct.
In fact, you testified yesterday that the shooting was from 12:51 p.m. to 1300.
Yes, correct.
To 1 o'clock.
Correct. Yes.
that email doesn't show whether or not Mr. Crumbley received it. Is that fair?
That right there doesn't tell me anything, other than it was sent to him.
All that tells you is that there was an email sent from the high school to Mr. Crumbley.
Correct.
At that email address.
Correct.
And at that time.
Correct.
You know that from 12:33 p.m. to 1:01 p.m., Mr. Crumbley was on a different DoorDash delivery.
Correct.
You know that Exhibit 148 shows that Mr. Crumbley went to the Meyer on Ray Road,
At what time?
1:11 p.m.
Correct.
Did you want to look at the exhibit?
Nope.
Okay. So at 1:11 p.m., Mr. Crumbley was at the Meyer on Ray Road. You don't recall any exhibits yesterday showing that Mr. Crumbley was picking up a DoorDash order around 1:11 p.m., correct?
Correct.
You know that Mr. Crumbley called his son based on Exhibit 136, which is his phone log. Mr. Crumbley called his son at 1:13 p.m.
Correct.
Would you like to look at the phone log to get the time?
That's about the right time.
Okay.
Correct, yes.
And you know that Mr. Crumbley remained at the Meyer, which was the reunification point after the Oxford High School shooting. Mr. Crumbley remained there from 1:11 p.m. to 1:17 p.m.
Correct.
So Mr. Crumbley called his son from the parking lot of the Meyer, which was the reunification point, at 1:13 p.m.
Correct.
He also called his son at 1:17 p.m.,
Correct.
which is right around the same time that he left the Meyer parking lot.
That's correct.
You know that there was a phone call, which was approximately less than 1 minute. And again, if you want to look at it, I can bring it
Just
to
to
you.
make, yes, please.
Sure.
Thank you.
There was a phone call at approximately 1:17 p.m. 1:16 p.m. between Mr. Crumbley and his wife, which lasted less than 1 minute.
Correct.
Mr. Crumbley called his son at 1:17 p.m.
That's correct.
He left the Meyer at approximately 1:17 p.m.
That's correct.
Called his son again at 1:18 p.m.
That's correct.
and again at 1:18 p.m. There were two phone calls at 1:18 p.m. seconds apart.
Correct.
Neither of them were answered.
Correct.
You also know, based on your involvement in this case, that his son was already in custody at that point.
That's correct.
He'd been taken into custody at 1 o'clock.
Correct.
You know that, again, based on 136, Mr. Crumbley's wife called him after he'd left the Meyer parking lot.
At 1:19 p.m., is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
Yes.
Mr. Crumbley was home at approximately 1:20 p.m. based on the exhibits, if you recall.
Correct.
He was home while he was on the phone with his wife.
That's correct.
You know that during the time that he was at home, he called 911.
Correct.
He called 911 because he discovered that the Sig Sauer and the ammunition for the Sig Sauer were both missing.
Speculation as to why he called 911, Judge.
He said in the phone call why he called 911.
Well, I guess that's a different question. You don't know why he called 911, but you did hear him. You did hear the 911 call that.
Correct.
that
Yes.
In that 911 call, Mr. Crumbley told the dispatcher that he saw and heard the sirens, if you remember the call.
Correct.
He said that he went to the Meyer after hearing and seeing the sirens,
Correct.
that his son was a student at Oxford High School,
That's correct.
that he heard that there was a shooting,
Correct.
that he discovered that his gun was missing,
That's correct.
that he didn't know if his son took the gun,
Correct.
and that he was freaking out.
That's correct.
After that phone call to 911, you know that James Crumbley received a phone call from law enforcement and he and his wife went to the substation in Oxford.
Correct.
They returned home around 2:30 p.m.
Correct.
There was some indication and some questioning yesterday from the prosecution about the white paper that had changed hands between James and Jennifer Crumbley at the school.
Correct.
Remember that? And the prosecution asked you if there was any indication that James Crumbley had made phone calls to doctors, hospitals, or physicians, correct?
I remember that, correct.
To your knowledge, and if you don't know, it's okay to tell me you don't know if there was anything requiring James to make those phone calls, correct?
I know nothing about the meeting.
And you know that the meeting was at approximately, ended around, I think we said 10:53 a.m.?
Correct?
And the shooting occurred at began at 12:51 p.m.
That's
It was
correct.
approximately 2 hours later. You also know that in those 2 hours, I'll withdraw that question. You testified about messages between Jennifer Crumbley and a person named Brian Malash.
Correct.
You have no idea whether Mr. Crumbley knew about those messages?
They were together at the time, other than that, I don't know.
Okay. You don't know if Mr. Crumbley knew what Jennifer Crumbley was saying to Brian Malash?
I do not know.
You know that at some point, Mr. Crumbley's son's name was made public.
Correct.
And it was fairly shortly after the shooting occurred, if you recall.
I don't recall when it was.
Were you aware that Mr. Crumbley and his wife began receiving threats to their safety as a result of what their son did at the high school?
I know in some chat threads there was talk of that, yes.
Were you aware that Mr. Crumbley and his wife had been made aware of some of those threats?
Yes.
Were you aware that there were concerns for Mr. Crumbley and his wife's safety as a result of some of those threats?
Oh, I'm sorry, I was aware, who was aware
That
about
there
this?
were concerns for Mr. Crumbley and his wife's safety as a result of some of those threats?
I know they
I have to
received
object
threats.
as to the characterization of what a threat is and what a threat is not. It's, as we know, Judge, it's very subjective.
Okay, so can you be more specific?
I can move on, Your Honor. My question was mainly if he knew that this occurred, and he said that he did hear something about some threats. I can move on from it, Your Honor. As a result of your involvement in this case, you were aware that Mr. Crumbley's son was criminally charged on December 1st of 2021.
That's correct.
That on December 2nd of 2021, there was an announcement from the prosecutor's office that Mr. Crumbley and his wife may be charged, if you recall the date.
I don't recall that.
On December 3rd, 2021 in the afternoon, that Mr. Crumbley and his wife were criminally charged for their son's actions, if you recall the date.
I'm sorry, I don't recall the dates all that happened.